Our gospel lesson this morning is from Luke's gospel, the 16th chapter, beginning with the 19th verse. Listen for the word of God. This is a teaching of Jesus. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water and cool my tongue. For I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all of this, between you and us a great chasm has been affixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And Abraham said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." May God add a blessing to this reading of the word. I spent 2 summers out in New Mexico at Ghost Ranch, as a PCUSA conference center, camp and center of mission in that very poverty-stricken area. And if you've ever been out to the southwest, how many know what an arroyo is? An arroyo is basically a gully that is carved by flowing waters that flow mostly only when there is a storm. They can be dangerous things because it doesn't have to be storming where you are in order for them to be full of water. They can be full of water from a storm that fell a couple miles away. And if you're in a dry arroyo, and about 95% of the time they are absolutely bone dry, if you're in a dry arroyo and suddenly you see a little trickle of water coming down the middle of it, you need to get to higher ground, because soon that trickle will become a torrent, and it will be loud and roaring, and there will be trees flowing by. It's a very, and I've seen that from a safe distance. It's a very powerful thing. But the interesting thing about arroyos is that they're like gullies and ditches that you see anywhere. They're like a lattice work, and the big ones are fed by slightly smaller ones, and those are fed by slightly smaller ones. And the longer they go and the more water that joins the water course, the deeper and bigger and steeper they become. One of the days that I was working at the ranch, my friend Baird and I had the same day off. I worked in the kitchen, he worked with children's activities. We didn't usually have the same day off, but this week we did, so we decided we would go for a long hike. And we hiked way out to one of the big, Mesa Montoya, which is kind of pretty far to the north of the ranch. And after we got there by way of the path, which was kind of out of our way, we decided that when we hiked back, we would just hike directly and we would get home in time for supper. So we headed off, just kind of overland without following a path, which turned out to be a bad idea. And, as we were coming along, there was just a small little trench in the ground. And at first we didn't even notice it, and one of us walked on one side, one of us walked on the other side of it, and we were talking about theology and philosophy and girls and all kinds of stuff as we walked along. And before you knew it, it was a little bit more substantial, and so we had to choose a side of this arroyo. And Baird came over to my side because, it looked as though if you looked straight at the distance and there was, another mesa that kind of marked where the ranch was, and it looked like that was the sensible one for us to take. So he came over to my side and we walked along, continued, minutes went by, hours went by, we were walking along, not really realizing that this arroyo was getting deeper and deeper, steeper, bigger as we walked. And that seemed not to make any difference because the ranch was over here and it was sort of running this way. But in the nature of these things, it began to turn us a little bit. And we just followed and we went along and it was turning us until it got to the point where we realized that the ranch was actually on the other side of the arroyo. And at this point it was too steep and too ragged to climb down and climb up the other side. So we thought, well, maybe there'll be a place where it's lower. But finally we got to this promontory where this now huge arroyo would dump its water off the edge of a very high cliff, off the mesa that we were hiking on to the plain below. And we were basically trapped. There was no way to get directly to the ranch from where we were. There was a chasm that separated us from dinner. And it was now late afternoon. And we realized that if we were going to backtrack far enough to get across this arroyo to the other side, that we were going to miss dinner, and it was going to be getting dark by the time we got back to the ranch. We did miss dinner, but luckily we knew where the key to the walk-in cooler was stored, and so we were able to hobble something together. But that experience, I think, is a good metaphor. Because the chasm that separated me and Baird from our dinner started out imperceptibly small. We didn't even know that we were being separated from dinner. And even when we realized that this was getting deeper and deeper, we thought we were on the right side of the chasm. And it wasn't until we had really committed ourselves that we realized that you can't get there from here. The chasm separated us from dinner. And there was nothing at that point that we could do about it. Keep that in mind, that sense of it starts small. You don't realize that the separation is happening. And you travel along thinking you're going in the right direction. And then you find yourself separated from where you want to be by a deep, uncrossable chasm. Because if you can imagine that metaphor, if you can work with that metaphor, I think you can understand what it is that Jesus is trying to teach in this story about Lazarus and the rich man. You need to know that the context of this follows a couple other teachings about money and about rich people, and the real listeners to this story, the real audience for this story, are the Pharisees, who Luke tells us were lovers of money. They were rich, they were well-to-do, they were well thought of, they were influential, they were involved in politics, they were the people to know and to be able to rub elbows with if you wanted any kind of opportunities in that culture, as well as being very influential in the religious life of Israel. Jesus teaches some really difficult parables in their hearing, and they kind of taunt him and laugh at him and ridicule him for his understanding of the spiritual nature of money and the spiritual dangers associated with the love of it. So they're the ones he's trying to talk to here. So he tells this story about a man named Lazarus and another man who doesn't have a name, who's just the rich guy. The first thing that you need to remember is that in the culture that Jesus is telling this in, to have a name is to be a real person. To know someone's name is to know them intimately. It's to know something about them. It's to have some power over them. In the book of Exodus, when God tells Moses his secret, sacred name, it is a powerful, amazing thing that God has done because God has given Moses power over himself. In the story about the midwives in slavery in Egypt, the storyteller of that part of Exodus gives us the names of the midwives, but not the name of the king of Egypt. It's a decision, a story-making decision, a narrative decision that turns the world on its head. It says this person is important, this person is not. You know this person's name. This person, you just have a description. Jesus tells this story about a man named Lazarus and this other guy who's rich. And Lazarus, he says, the rich man lives in a big house, lives behind a gate. And he is dressed in purple and satin, which tells us he's rich, but also that he's probably royalty and maybe has political power as well. So he's a person of influence, both because of his wealth and because of his position in the community. But we're not told his name, just that he lives behind a gate and that he feasts sumptuously every day. Sumptuous, it's not a word we use much, but it's like when you eat really expensive food and you eat it all the time and you're never hungry and you have a really big food budget. He overeats, he overconsumes, he eats sumptuously. And then there's Lazarus outside the gate, who would be satisfied just with the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. But he clearly does not have the crumbs from the rich man's table. And as he lays there covered with sores, undoubtedly sores that are associated with malnutrition, the only comfort that he has is that the dogs come and lick his sores, which is a sort of pale comfort, since dogs would have been considered unclean and it would have been humiliating for them to be in that situation. But he's helpless enough. He's lying outside the gate. Now here's the thing you also need to notice is that the rich man, we're told nothing about him. We're not told that he's a meanie. We're not told that he's cruel. We're not told that he's unrighteous. We're not told anything bad about him. The only thing that we know about him is that he eats a lot, and he eats well, and that he's built a gate between himself and the outside world. It isn't that he is being unjust or mean or bad to Lazarus. The thing that is a problem with this fellow is that he simply does not see Lazarus at all. He is oblivious to Lazarus, to his situation, to his need. And Lazarus is not just some nameless homeless person. He's a real person with a real name. He might be Roger, or Bob, or Jim, or Ken. He's a real person, a person you could know. And the rich person doesn't even know it. He's walking along, and there is a chasm between him and Lazarus. He doesn't recognize, even though the chasm is of his own making, The separation is of his own making. He doesn't recognize the chasm that separates him from Lazarus. He doesn't even see or know Lazarus, and he walks along the path of his life when he could substantially and materially improve the life and existence of this man without even noticing it, with just the crumbs from his table. He could materially change Lazarus' situation. But he doesn't even see it. He's blind to it. And he walks along. And the chasm gets deeper. And then something really important happens. Jesus says that Lazarus dies right there outside the gate of the rich man's house. And the angels come and bear him away to heaven where he sits. The old-fashioned words were in the bosom of Abraham. And you may have sung that old spiritual, in the bosom of Abraham. Rest in my soul in the bosom of Abraham. And on the same day, the rich man dies and he's buried. And he ends up not in the bosom of Abraham, but somewhere else. And now suddenly, he sees Lazarus. He sees Lazarus, and he sees the chasm that separates him from Lazarus. And now it's he who is suffering, and Lazarus who is comforted. And he asks Father Abraham if he will just send Lazarus. Now he knows his name. Across the chasm to dip his finger, just a minor thing, just dip his finger in the water to give him some relief from his torment. He sees Lazarus, he knows Lazarus' name, and yet what he wants is for Lazarus to cross the gully, the arroyo, the gap between them. And it might be that Lazarus would be willing to do that. But Father Abraham says, no, you had your good stuff during your life, and Lazarus had nothing, and now things are reversed. And if that weren't enough, he says, this chasm is such that it's too deep. It's too broad. The sides are too steep. No one from this side, even if they wanted to, could cross over to you. And no one from there can cross over to us. Do you see how he has walked along this gap? He's walked along this chasm. And he's walked so far that now it can't be crossed. It can't be crossed for someone else's benefit, and it can't be crossed for his. And in this case, there's no backtracking. He's sort of, made his decision, and now he has to live with it and die with it. And here's the interesting thing about the story that Jesus tells. God is on the same side of the chasm as the poor and as the hungry. Sometimes the story gets interpreted as being, well, the rich man was not good at sharing, and so he got punished by going to hell. This is not a story about punishment. This is not a story about bad children being punished. This is a story about decisions and choices and directions that lead to a particular place. Actions that have natural consequences. This rich man has chosen not to see the poor and the hungry around him. He has chosen not to respond to those who are in need. What he doesn't realize in the process is that when he separates himself, when he allows himself to be on the other side of the chasm from the poor and from the needy and from the people who need something from him, when he makes that choice, he's also choosing to be on the other side of the chasm from God. And that wasn't God's choice. That wasn't Abraham's choice. That was his choice. There came a moment when he couldn't cross. And then the rich man starts to think, he says, and this is, I think, where you and I enter this story. So far, we're not there yet, I don't think. I don't think Jesus wants to put us either in the place of Lazarus or in the place of the rich man. But I think the point where we enter the story is coming up here, because the rich man says, okay, I get it. I've made my bed, now I have to lie in it. But I have these 5 brothers. Send Lazarus back from the dead to visit my father's house and my 5 brothers and warn them about what their choices mean. And Abraham says, just like you, they had Moses and the prophets. They had the law. And the prophets, who are very clear about the obligation of God's people to be attentive to the needs of the widows, the fatherless, the poor, the hungry, and so forth, the oppressed. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Micah, it's very clear if you read them. That's where God's attention is in the words that he speaks to the prophets. They have Moses and the prophets, and if they're unwilling to listen to them, I don't think that they'll even be convinced by somebody coming back from the dead, which may be a little prefigurement of Jesus' death and resurrection. If you're unwilling to be convinced of where you are and where you are heading, then you're unwilling to be convinced, and you likely won't be, no matter what. And I think this is where Jesus wants his hearers, and he wants the Pharisees, and he wants the disciples, and he wants all of us to put ourselves in this story, because we are the ones who are still alive. We are the ones who are still on this side of the grave. We are the ones who are still walking along the edge of a chasm that we can easily jump across. We have Moses and the prophets and the Gospels and the letters of Paul. We have the example of Jesus Christ, who gives himself for those who do not deserve it. We have all the information we need to understand that when we put ourselves on the opposite side of the chasm from those who are hungry, those who are poor, and those who are oppressed, that we're not just making a decision about economics, we're making a spiritual decision about who we will stand with and in whose bosom we will rest. Jesus wants us to think clearly about that and what it means. And it's a decision that gets made every day, a little bit at a little bit. We had the great pleasure of spending an entire day yesterday with our son Levi and his wife Hannah. This past week was Levi's birthday, and he said, we're going to be in Chicago and we would love to spend Saturday with you. And so we decided that we would go to a play, one of the big Broadway productions there at the Bank of America Theater, and we dropped a chunk of cash for some tickets that weren't that good. We were in the dress circle, but the balcony was kind of coming down like this, and you kind of had, if you wanted to see the stuff in the back, you sort of had to go like this. But it was his birthday, and when your kid says, I'm coming to Chicago just to see you, you don't say no, do you? So we did that, and we dropped a chunk of cash, and then we took them out to dinner where we dropped another big chunk of cash. And we had a wonderful dinner. And we sat, I bet we were there for 3 hours, and we just talked and talked and talked. We talked about the play, we talked about lives, we talked about jobs, we talked about church, we talked about everything. And then we broke up. It was time to go catch our train back to East Chicago, and we were just going down the Randolph Street stairs down into the Millennium Station, and there was this homeless gentleman sitting at the top of the stairs. And he said, can you spare some change to me? And I actually, I guess to my credit, I looked at him, made eye contact with him, and said, not tonight. Because in that, when you're making that little, you're making that calculation in your head real fast what you're going to do, I realized I didn't have any small change. I didn't have any dollars. I didn't even have a $5. I had 2 20s in my wallet. And I made this calculation that $20 $20 was too much to give to this man. This man who probably has a name like Lamar or Jim or Bob or something. But $20 was too much. We have a budget to follow. We're not made of money. And so I made the decision, I said, not tonight. And he said, God bless you, and was very pleasant about it. And, it was not an unpleasant exchange. But as I was continuing down the stairs, I was thinking, okay, $85 per ticket, and, a lot of money at this nice Italian restaurant. And we don't have the money. We're on a budget. I can't afford to give this guy $20 because I was too busy spending that money on myself. Now, I don't know whether I should have given the money to that guy or whether I shouldn't. That's not the point. The point was that when I did that calculation in my head, it was like, oh, I've already spent, these gazillion dollars on this wonderful day with my family, and I can't afford, because of my budget, to help this man. It turned out to be just a really, from the short engagement that we had, a really pleasant, actual, real human being with a name, probably not Lazarus, but similar. The arroyo that separates us from other human beings who need us starts small. And the arroyo that separates us from the God who paid everything and gave everything for us starts small. But as we walk down the path of our life, if we fail to reach out to our brothers and sisters who need us, if we continue to go and say, oh, I've got a budget that only allows me to spend lots of money on myself, it doesn't allow me to spend anything on someone else, if we make those decisions day after day, that arroyo, that gap, that chasm gets wider and deeper and rougher and steeper and harder to cross. Jesus' story seems to suggest that once you cross the boundary from life into death, that you can't unmake your decisions and you can't make new decisions. I don't know whether that's true, because I also believe that the grace of God is unstoppable and unlimitable. Even death itself cannot keep God from reaching across chasms and saving us from ourselves. I don't want to say Jesus is wrong. I'm just saying I don't know about that. But I do know that what Jesus says about this chasm, this separation, getting deeper and wider and harder to cross, is true. And I also know that what Jesus says about God and the poor being together on the same side of the chasm is true. And if we choose to separate ourselves from the people who need us, we are also separating ourselves from God. We have lots of personal choices. One of the things I love about Habitat for Humanity that Bill was telling us about earlier is the fact that the homeowner, who's always called the homeowner, works with, they have to put in a certain amount of sweat equity, a certain number of hours into the building of their home. And that's not just for their sake, though it is for their sake, because it gives them a level of dignity and investment in the house, but it's also for the sake of the volunteers who help, because they are not a faceless person. They're a real person. Madge, or Susan, or Bill, and their kids. And suddenly we can't not see someone who is poor. We can't not see someone who is hungry in the way that we could before. My wife asked me as we were talking about this sermon yesterday, she said, what do you want people to do as a result of having heard this sermon? I'm not sure what I want you to do. I guess I want you to look into the faces of real human beings who need you whenever you get the chance. Knowing that the face of Christ is either right there in that face or right there beside it. And that He's calling you to be of service to others. I guess I'm asking you to communicate with your representatives at every level of government and say it's important for us to meet the needs, the hunger needs of poor families as a country. I guess I'm asking you to find ways to be involved in the lives of real people that allow you to see their humanity, to see yourself in their place. I guess I'm asking you to look at what Jesus has done for you through his life, his teachings, his love, his healing, his death, and his resurrection, and ask yourself, how can I reflect that love into a world full of hungry people, in a world full of poor people who don't have the chances and the opportunities that I have had? And ask yourself, how can I be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ in the world? Thanks be to God.